So welcome, as the big screens say, to the 10th annual University of Glasgow Learning and Teaching Conference. I'm very pleased to welcome so many people here this morning. For those of you who I don't know yet, my name's Matthew Williamson and I'm the Director of the Learning Enhancement and Academic Development Service here at the University of Glasgow, and it's our department that's organised and managed and will be trying to make sure today runs as smoothly as we possibly can. First of all, I just want to say that this is probably the largest conference we've had. Assuming everyone turns up, we've got around 390 delegates today, which I think is amazing that a learning and teaching conference at a research-intensive institution can attract so many colleagues to come and spend the day to think about learning and teaching and enhancing the student journey. So I hope you enjoy the day. I think it's going to be a very interesting day. There are some really exciting presentations, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with people during the day. And I'm going to hand over to Frank Coton, who is the Vice Principal for Academic and Educational Innovation, to say a few words. Frank.
Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here, and particularly given that this is the 10th annual University Learning and Teaching Conference. Who would have believed it? You know, the first conference doesn't seem that long ago. It's hard to believe it's 10. But this event has grown year on year. It's attracted more interest in terms of the numbers of presentations being submitted to it year on year. And it is now consistently the biggest event that we run in the university for staff. And that's really down to you. It's your commitment that has made this event the success that it is. And I've got absolutely no doubt that it's going to continue to go from strength to strength in the future. So I'm doubly pleased about that. And actually, I should also say that I'm triply pleased, and I'm not even sure that's a word. I know it's a place, but I'm not sure it's a word. Because this year, I've had the luxury of taking a back seat while Matthew and his team have done all the hard work in organising this conference. And they have done an absolutely terrific job. It's a great program. There's a lot of really exciting innovations in the program this year, and I know that you're all going to have a great day. So I'd like to thank Matthew and his team personally for the work that they've put into this. Last year, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Neil Juster, stood in this place to open the conference, and he mentioned how the first Learning and Teaching Conference had come about during a change in direction of sorts for the university. It was following the launch of the university's new strategy, Building on Excellence, a strategy which featured learning and teaching as the first of its 5 key objectives. That strategy was a catalyst for positive change in our learning and teaching culture here at the university. A change that's continuing today, and if anything, it's gathering pace. As many of you will know, 2 years ago, we launched the successor to the successor of Building on Excellence, which is inspiring people, changing the world. This strategy makes significant commitments to our future direction, and change is now beginning to flow from those commitments. I've said in front of groups in the university many times that when I've been asked, what's the point of a strategy? My usual response to that is that if something is in our strategy, then there's a very good chance that it will happen. But if it isn't in the strategy, there's almost no chance it's going to happen in terms of investment from the university. So it's important that we shape that strategic direction, but it's also important that we deliver against it. let's consider the one thing that the university strategy puts first and foremost, and that one thing is our people. Inspiring people sets out our stall to ensure that our teaching staff are properly supported in the vital work that they do. This includes providing new CPD opportunities to support their professional development, not only at the beginning of their career, but at all stages of their career. In this respect, over the last 2 years, we've been evolving our early career development programme for new staff, and we've successfully delivered the RET scheme, recognising excellence in teaching, for staff in the later stages of their careers. In the near future, a flavour of the early career development programme is going to be developed for the new learning, teaching and scholarship career track to ensure that staff who are on that track get the best possible support to kickstart their careers. And I know that Matthew and his team have got plans to further develop the RET scheme for staff at the later stages of their career. Our strategy also committed to making sure that teaching is rewarded and respected within the university. And this year we revised the academic promotions process for the learning, teaching and scholarship track. And that wasn't just a revision of the promotions process, it was a revision of the expectations of the job. It was an alignment of the job expectations to the promotions. And that is going to be followed up by a whole range of activity to look at better mentoring support, a more appropriate deployment of performance and development review to support the developmental aspects of staff, and support for engagement with scholarship. In doing this work, we've looked across the UK and we've looked globally at practice elsewhere. And I personally believe that the approach that we are taking in this university is sector leading. And I think we're going to see significant benefit from it in the years ahead. So watch this space. There's a lot more to come as far as that's concerned. But let's be clear, we've still got a lot of work to do to get us to where we need to be. And where we need to be is to be globally recognised as the destination of choice for excellent teachers worldwide. To do this, we've got to create the right physical and virtual environments for our staff and students. And our strategy committed us to achieving this too. And there's a lot happening in this space. You might have seen some of the new pilot teaching rooms that have been established across the campus, creating environments that support and encourage interactive teaching. And there's more to follow. You'll see another tranche of pilot rooms appearing this summer, and then you'll see more after that. In fact, within the new capital plan, the commitment on annual spend to the redevelopment of teaching space is now £2.4 million per annum. To put that in context, for the last 10 years, the level of expenditure has been £1.1 million less than that on an annual basis. So it's a significant uplift in the investment in our teaching spaces and teaching infrastructure. And as we upgrade the physical infrastructure, we'll make sure that the virtual infrastructure is also developed to support that, and that our IT infrastructure allows us to do what we need to do. And unless you've been hiding away for the last 2 years, you'll already know about the new Learning and Teaching Hub. If you haven't seen the hub design, or even if you have, take a look at the virtual reality simulation of the hub in the Senate room. It'll give you a real insight to what this new facility is going to be like. That's, of course, if you can pry me away from it, because I want to see it too. To give you an idea of the scale here, in December, the University Court agreed the funding envelope for the hub. So the funding envelope is up to £97 million for the development of this facility. We've also secured planning permission and the design is effectively done. We're now working on the finer points of it. So the project is now really rolling. In fact, if you're in the School of Mathematics and Statistics, you'll know this only too well. The new temporary building, and temporary, I should say, is in the context of 30 years. I'm not saying mathematics and statistics will be in that building for 30 years, but the building will last for at least 30 years. The new temporary building is nearly complete. It should be finished by the end of April, and then the School of Mathematics and Statistics will move to their new home, and then in the summer, the old Mathematics and Statistics building will be no more. It will be demolished. I've said this a few times in a variety of fora, but I'm going to say it again here. I'm absolutely indebted to the school for the constructive way in which they have engaged with this process. It isn't a trivial thing to uproot what you do and move it somewhere else. And I really hope that the school gets the benefits out of the new environment that we really envisaged when we started this project. So be in no doubt, the Learning and Teaching Hub is a massive statement of our commitment to teaching and the student experience in this university. It is the first major development of the new expanded campus. It's the largest change in our teaching environment since the university took the decision to move to this site in the 19th century. The hub and the other developments that I've described are creating an environment that will empower rather than constrain your approach to teaching. And for me, that's the most exciting aspect of all of this. But we have a responsibility here. We need to take this opportunity to reflect and develop our practice if we're going to capitalize on this opportunity. It's tempting simply to recreate more of what we have. But actually now is the time to think, and to think in a broader sense about the curriculum and how that should develop in the future. I know that in various parts of the university, work's already underway to look at the shape of the curriculum. And staff are also reflecting critically on their own practice, considering, for example, how technology can improve the learning experience, or how assessment can be designed to more effectively support learning. We're learning, for example, from our engagement with online degrees. We're learning from our engagement with MOOCs. We're learning in a whole range of ways. And one thing I'd highlight to you, and this is on a number of the seats, is Gusto, which basically is capturing a lot of the good practice in learning and teaching and making it easily available to you to draw on to develop your own practice. So when you go into your next class, you can go in with Gusto. Sorry, that was very cringeworthy. It reminded me of a joke that I heard years ago, which was about a man that bought a dog for his wife. The dog was called Great Reluctance. And she said, "Why did you call the dog Great Reluctance?" He said, "Well, just so that you know, when I go on a business trip, I'll be leaving you with great reluctance." But there we are. Talking about MOOCs for a second, I'd like to take this opportunity to make an announcement about our future engagement with MOOCs. As some of you will be aware, we deliver our MOOCs through the FutureLearn platform. Until now, FutureLearn has provided access to the platform free of charge, and FutureLearn has generated revenue from certificate sales. These are certificates given for participation in the MOOC or completion in the MOOC. The university has received a small share of this income, but it's not enough to be of any significance. But this arrangement is changing, and in future, we will be making an upfront payment to FutureLearn. But in return for that, we will get an increased revenue share from the sales of certificates. What I wanted to announce today is that the upfront cost of participating in the Future Learn Partnership will be paid centrally by the university. And the senior management group has agreed that the revenue generated by the MOOCs will be returned to the areas of the university that create and run the MOOCs. Further details of this scheme is going to be announced in due course, but what I hope is that this will provide a stimulus for more areas of the university to engage with MOOCs and to experiment in that space. Let me now return to the event today. I would like to welcome and acknowledge those who are here from other institutions. This is not just a University of Glasgow event. We opened the conference to external delegates a few years back, and it's been a fabulously enriching experience for this event. I hope the event will be equally rewarding for all of you that have travelled to be here today. For the last 9 years, this conference has provided a valuable opportunity for us to share and reflect on our practice, to open our minds to the art of the possible, identify opportunities for collaboration with others who have similar interests, and I hope today will be just as good a forum for this. And I absolutely encourage you to make the most of what is a precious day away from the office. I'll give the final word to a statement at the heart of our strategy, our mission as a university, to bring inspiring people together. I think this conference is the embodiment of that statement, and I think it tells you everything you need to know about the day ahead. So please enjoy your day. Thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Simon Lancaster is Professor of Chemistry Education at the University of East Anglia. He's a National Teaching Fellow, was awarded the Royal Society of Chemistry Higher Education Teaching Award in 2013, and is also the UEA's Pedagogical Innovation Ambassador. That's quite a title. I thought my title was bad, but anyway. Given the direction of travel within this university, his keynote today is particularly timely. Simon's going to talk about basically how you can reimagine what you can do in conventional lecture spaces. As I said earlier, we are redeveloping our teaching spaces, including changing a lot of our lecturing spaces into more interactive environments. But that can't happen overnight. It will happen progressively. So what Simon has to say today, I hope, will encourage you to think about how we can use our more conventional spaces more creatively. He promises to challenge us to think differently, and I'm sure he's going to do that. So I'm not going to say sit back and relax, because I suspect you're not going to get the chance to do that. But please welcome Simon Lancaster.
We do have some technology for you this morning. So the first slide in the presentation is instructions on how to use the University of Glasgow's in-house Yakka's system for audience response. So I'll say a little bit more about that as I go along. However, the first slide is how to log into that system. So I encourage you all to retrieve your devices. I don't expect you to sit there like, I don't know, highly attentive monks and copy down everything I say. What I'd like you to do is to engage with me, to comment on what I'm saying, to answer the questions I provide, and also to tweet as you go along. Because I don't happen to believe, no matter how entertaining I try to be that it is possible for me to hold your attention for a full hour. I'm going to give it my very best shot. I'm going to throw the kitchen sink of interactivity and anecdote and flamboyance at you as I go through this keynote. But I also know that it's not human nature to pay attention for a full hour. It is in fact highly ironic that we have a learning and teaching conference in which the primary way of getting our message across is to give a lecture on what we're doing. So I'm going to try to run with that format and with the limitations of that format and do something a little bit different today. Okay, so reimagining the affordances of the lecture theatre. I'm going to start off with a little bit of biography. How on earth does a chemist from Norwich find themselves keynoting at a learning and teaching conference at the University of Glasgow? And wow, I have never given a talk in a venue like this. I've been privileged to have some large audiences, but never a venue like this. I may become overcome with awe at a point in this presentation, and you'll have to forgive me because I look around, I see lots of expectant faces, but I also see some absolutely incredible architecture. So I'm a chemist. That means that I am a pragmatist. It means that I was appointed not because I have any learning and teaching qualification whatsoever. I was appointed as a chemist at a research-intensive university at East Anglia in Norwich because I have the chemistry equivalent of green fingers. When I do a chemical reaction, it works, and I isolate beautiful crystals, which we stick on a diffractometer, we get the structure, and we publish it in 3-star journals. That's my aspiration. But it became really very difficult to get funding for that as I went along. And so at the same time, I was enjoying my teaching. I would come along into the lecture theatre armed with a set of PowerPoint slides, because frankly I've got an appalling handwriting, so I embraced PowerPoint at a very early stage. I had a collection of anecdotes because I'm a chemist. The subtitle for my first year chemistry module is 101 Ways to Start a Fire. And I delivered 101 ways to start a fire to my chemistry students. And they loved it. They loved the fact that I had all of these anecdotes. They loved the fact that I gave them on a plate what they needed for the examination. And of course, I set that examination. And so everything in the garden was apparently rosy. I was getting excellent module evaluation scores. My students were getting good honours degrees. All the KPIs were wonderful. However, I had to mark the examination papers. And although they could reproduce a good honours answer, they could collect sufficient of the marks, inevitably many of them would reveal that although they could reproduce an acceptable answer, they gave away that they didn't understand. And the older I got, the more I tried to refine my teaching, the more anecdotes I introduced into my lectures, the more confident I became, the more I waved my hands around, the more the students appreciated it, but they still didn't understand the underlying chemistry. They would still, almost like that sort of St. Peter moment, deny even having learnt the topics I presented in year one when the year two lecturers broached them. I couldn't see the point in continuing that kind of teaching approach. So I began to look for something different. I embarked, just like this conference, on a journey. Now, this journey has taken me well over 10 years. And what I'm trying to do in a session like today is to save you some of that 10 years. Many of you here are research-based academics. And as a research-based academic, you would not dream of embarking on a new piece of research without having surveyed the literature, found out what someone had done before, and built on what people had done before. And yet in teaching, so often in the disciplines, that doesn't happen. You don't go to the teaching literature and find out what is effective. So what I'm talking about today has an evidence base. And we can talk about that at the end if you like, but that evidence base is published in 4-star journals based on meta-reviews of enormous numbers of pieces of work. It isn't, as I'll present an evaluation comment in a little while from one of my students, my opinion. It's based on a huge body of research, and I want to share it with you, and I want to save you some of the last 10 years of study that I've had. Now, I've already said this, I really don't mind. In fact, I really want you to retrieve your devices from your pockets, from your bags. You will need them to run the Yakka system, but at the same time, if you think Lancaster's gone too far this time, and it's at some point you don't think I've gone too far, then I failed in my role as a keynote. I'm trying to challenge you. I've got a whole bank of really contentious statements that I will pull out if I don't think you look challenged enough. Okay? So we're trying to challenge you at some point. And you can keep challenging me. You don't have to agree with everything I say. My God, it would be a very boring presentation if you agreed with absolutely everything I say. But you're not allowed to keep that disagreement to yourself. Oh no. You need to share it. And the perfect mechanism for you to share that is through the conference hashtag. So tweet to this conference hashtag. Crowdsource a record of the conference, but do more than that. Have a back channel, have a discussion going about it. Comment on how it might be relevant to your work. Comment on how I've gone too far and exaggerated too much and strayed from the evidence base. Do all of those things, and then I'll have something to do when I'm on the coach back to Edinburgh Airport later on. So, every good presentation has a contents page, of course, but we're on a journey. So here's the journey. I'm going to start off by talking about the lecture. I'm going to move from the lecture to all the thorny issues about lecture capture, because I've been capturing my teaching since about 2006. And I have a lot to say about the notion of lecture capture, especially as it's implemented in many institutions at the moment. And then we'll talk about this idea of flipping. And if you haven't heard of flipping, that's fine. I'll explain what it means. And I'll explain to you why I describe myself as a post-flipping academic. I'm kind of over flipping, but in order to get over flipping, I would have had to go on a really quite dramatic journey. And I'm going to share that with you, why I've got to the post-flipping point. And I will talk about the absolute key, in my mind, for what constitutes good learning and teaching experience. It's the questions. Whether it be on a MOOC, whether it be on your virtual learning environment, whether it be in your exam papers, whether it be in your lecture theatre. The key is the question. And I think we don't spend enough time thinking about our questions. A good question, as we'll see, and as we'll feel, and as we'll engage with, precipitates a good discussion. And if you're a social constructivist like me, you believe that that is where the real learning takes place. So although I have the capacity to talk for that England place, I really, really want to get to the interactivity as quickly as possible during this presentation. So let's start off with one of these questions. So this is an unfamiliar audience response technology for me, but that's great, because quite frankly, it shouldn't be about the technology. It should be about the pedagogy. I'm not suggesting that this is the ultimate question. I will get on to what I believe are the ultimate questions later in this presentation. But what I do want is for you to engage. Now, first lesson of this presentation. If you pose a question, as we are doing at the moment, that consumes time. I have to give time for you to answer the question. If you are going to practice active learning, you are going to have to find time during your teaching sessions. And that's a theme that we're going to have to come back to. One response to finding time is to flip. I'll talk about other responses to doing that. So I've used the expression here, active learning. Now that might mean a whole raft of different things to you, and many of you will want to come back and talk to me about this definition. You can interpret this in any way you like. However, I'm not talking about the student sitting there, staring at the lecturer, waiting to be inspired, waiting to be edutained. That's a brilliant word, isn't it? Waiting for that magic to happen just because they're in the same room as that person. I'm talking about an experience where someone actually has to do something. And I'm not, incidentally, referring to some of those triangles you've seen. Lesson number 2 for this keynote. Anything presented in the form of a triangle is almost invariably completely devoid of an evidence base. Okay? So if you've seen something presented in a triangle, then that should ring the alarm bells immediately. These triangles are intuitively wonderfully interactive, but they very rarely have an evidence base. So much of what we experience in life very rarely has an evidence base. Okay, so let's see how your responses have gone. Craig, if you can bring up the answers. Okie dokie, right, so we've got a very large majority of you going for answers A and B, regarding there as being relatively little time, less than 30% of your lecture time in which the students are actively engaged. Right, remember that figure if you can, that's always a challenge. Remembering anything presented in a session like this is a huge challenge, which is one of the reasons there are very few big ideas in this presentation, because I actually don't think that cramming a keynote full of enormous amounts of information is going to be effective. There's only so many lessons one can take away in the course of an hour. Right, I'm going to come back to that in a moment or two. Can we just click on, Craig? Okay. So, the lecture. Now, I'm kind of glad that we are not in one of the University of Glasgow's, as Frank talked about, brand spanking new pilot learning and teaching spaces. They are absolutely lovely. They are conducive to interactive learning. They're great for getting students around in team-based learning or problem-based learning sessions. Great. But most of us are familiar with spaces and familiar with delivering teaching in more or less a traditional sense. So at an institution like the University of Glasgow, you've got lots of traditional learning and teaching spaces, lots of traditional lecture theatres, great lecture theatres. And the traditional argument would go something like, well, these things are not conducive for active learning. We're going to take that head on. We're not in one of those spaces today, but we're also not in one of those state-of-the-art active learning hubs with movable furniture in here, okay? So this is an ideal situation for me to put my money where my mouth is and to actually practice the kind of pedagogies that I'm preaching about today. But there are some real positives about the lecture, I believe. If you look in the Times Higher Education magazine or the Guardian Higher Education supplement, the journalists are playing with us. Every month or so, they will publish an article from someone saying, the lecture is dead. And then they come back with the counter-argument, no, the lecture is not dead. The lecture is all about inspiration. If you think the lecture is dead, you are doing it wrong. You are not inspiring your students strongly enough. And then the ball gets thrown back to the other court and someone else says, no, it's unethical to lecture. We've got to stop lecturing. Active learning is that much more effective. I am tired of this argument. I used to, a few short years ago, be one of those people who said, well, really, you know, the lecture is dead. The problem is, actually, we don't agree what constitutes a lecture. That's at the heart of the problem. So those people who will say, my lectures are really active, I'm always posing questions to my students, those students are having to think very hard during my lectures. I have a lot of time for that sentiment. However, let's take that to its logical conclusion. If you pose a question like the one we just did, why use technology? Well, I'll tell you why I use technology. Because I will typically, and I'll watch my colleagues in peer observation systems, and they're interactive. They will pose a question. They will ask their students a question. Sometimes you get that sort of tumbleweed moment where nobody answered it and there's a deathly silence. Famously, there's a quote from a maths lecturer where they did this and nobody answered the maths lecturer, and the maths lecturer said, that's okay, I'm a maths lecturer. Nobody can out-awkward a maths lecturer, and covered it over in that sense. More likely is that one or two people who typically, I'm not pointing at these individuals in particular, typically would sit at the front. It would be like this. Every time you ask a question, their hand goes up. They're great. They're a fig leaf for our interactivity. We're grateful to these students. They always respond to our questions and answer our questions. Always. So what about the rest of the students? What about the 95% of the student body who are not sitting at the front, who are tired, or not tired, but expect teacher's pet to stick their hand up and answer the question? Very quickly, I suggest to you, that cohort of students sitting at the front cease to believe that the questions are even directed at them. They think questions are for teacher's pet. That, to me, is where the technology comes in. I don't pose a question I expect to be responded to by one or two students putting their hands up and giving me the answer. I pose a question in such a fashion that everybody has a voice, that everybody is expected to answer the question. So far, I think we had 85 responses, is that right, Craig? So we had 85 responses to our first question. Well, we may not have 395 people at this conference yet, but we've got a lot more than 85. So if you are one of those lecturers or one of those staff developers who does sessions and they pose questions and they've ever had a tumbleweed moment, don't be like that now. Engage with me. Answer the questions. There are some questions that I'm going to be posing in this session where the pedagogy won't work unless you commit yourself to an answer. You don't have to know what the right answer is in advance. That's most of the fun of this exercise. But you do have to commit yourself to an answer. So I want everybody to commit themselves to an answer in these sessions. Now, I have a colleague, and his name is Dr. David Reed. He's at the University of Southampton. And I don't suppose he's the only person to have said something similar to this, but I like to get my quotes properly sourced. So I was there when Professor Reed said what can go online should go online, so I know definitively that he did this. Remember, we've been talking about evidence this morning. When you give a quotation in your lectures, in your presentation, do you check the veracity of that quotation? Because there's one thing more likely to be misrepresented than a triangle, and that's a quotation. Now, there are famous ones about Benjamin Franklin and the internet, for example, but there is a wonderful resource on Twitter called Quote Investigator. And if you're going to give a very telling quote during one of your presentations, you would expect your students to get their referencing right. I think we should do that as well. If we're going to use resources like pithy quotes in our keynotes, in our presentations, we need to get the references right. And so I put a lot of trouble over the years into making sure these are right. So what do we do? Okay, Well, what we practice is a model of lecture flipping. Now, in order to consider this model of lecture flipping, first of all, I want to talk about the affordances or otherwise of lecture capture. So, who here, let's have a show of hands. We haven't got an audience response question, but we're all very brave individuals. Who here captures their lectures? So quite a few of you capture your lectures. Okay, who here has used the captured lecture to totally transform the way that they deliver their teaching? Okay, brilliant. So we have one or two amongst you in doing it. What I'm going to be suggesting is that lecture capture should not be an end in itself. Now, let's be clear. I come from south of the border. Now, you will look at the shenanigans that go on south of the border in politics and higher education, and if you don't laugh at us, then you should be laughing at what is going on south of the border. Okay? But we have an enormous importance attached to perceptions that students have of certain things. So let's take lecture capture. If you are an institution and you introduce lecture capture a couple of years into your degree programme, then you can quite reasonably expect a bounce in the student satisfaction. Students want lecture capture. They really want lecture capture. They'll use that lecture capture in a number of different ways that I'll come on to. But it's incontrovertible, it's unarguable that lecture capture would benefit students with learning disabilities, being able to listen to things again at their own pace, students for whom English is not their first language. These things are very valuable. But then it's very interesting to actually look at how your lecture capture resources are used. So one of the questions that people ask most often is, if I capture my lectures, will that deter students from turning up in the first place? All the evidence is, no, it doesn't. It doesn't, any more than putting a copy of your notes online deters students from actually coming. So attendance at lectures in my institution is running at maybe 60 or 70%. There are a large number of students who are not attending any given teaching session. But that's completely nothing to do with whether or not that you're providing a captured format for it. The most telling thing for me is when you look down at a discipline level in what students are actually doing with this lecture capture. And the best study I know that was done by Moira Sarsfield at Imperial College. So Imperial College, you may say, well, Imperial College just teaches science. But for those of us who teach science, science is a very, very, very broad church. And on one extreme, you've got mathematics. On the other extreme, you've got, say, biological sciences. So how do mathematicians or mathematics students use captured lectures? The way that they use them is they watch them immediately after the lecture, maybe repeatedly, and never view the recording again. That's what mathematics students generally do with captured lectures. What do biology students do with captured lectures? Biology students don't look at the captured lecture immediately after the session. They only look at it just before the examination. And they might look at it the night before the examination. They might look at every single copy of a lecture in the 8 hours immediately preceding their examination. Now, how do my chemistry students do? Actually, they're somewhere between the mathematicians and the biologists, as many of you might have expected, but to be honest, they are closer to the behaviour of the biologists than they are of the mathematicians. Who here, I'm not even going to ask for a show of hands, who here honestly believes that cramming, binge-watching lecture recordings the night before your exam is an effective use of lecture recordings as a learning resource? I don't think many of us do, and I think many of us are horrified. In fact, if we were brave, if we were not obsessed with the NSS, if we really wanted to facilitate the best learning and teaching for our students, we would block access to our lecture recordings a week or 2 weeks before the examination. No, I'm not suggesting you do that, okay? Nobody is going to have the courage to do that, least of all me, to have the courage to do that. But if you see the way that students actually use it. So, lecture capture is incredibly popular with the students. Again, the Imperial College study shows that there is no correlation between the amount at which students view the recorded lectures and their grades. That's not to say that 1 or 2 students benefit in their grades for having it, but there is no correlation between the amount of times students view those recorded lectures and how they do. Now, let's take the other scenario. You've got a new student and they enter the University of Glasgow in year 1 and there are recordings of lectures in the lecture theatre. From year 1 of the degree programme, they go all the way through their degree programme being used to having lecture capture provided. Much as your current students go all the way through the degree programme having used to finding copies of their notes on the virtual learning environment. How much of a brownie point boost in the National Student Satisfaction Survey do you expect for that? It's a hygiene factor. It is part of the furniture. Now, I don't have an enormous amount of time to address all of the aspects of this, but one thing that I've done is to actually engage my students in creating video resources, in creating screencasts, in creating interactive screencasts, actually posing questions. If you engage your students in producing teaching resources, they will learn all sorts of additional transferable skills. But as a side effect, they will appreciate the effort that you are putting in to providing these teaching resources. And that's the danger, I fear, that once teaching lecture capture becomes routine, that it's no longer sort of appreciated. Right, the other benefit that I think we can have of lecture capture is I was at the University of Leeds. I shouldn't probably name it, but there you go, I've done it. I was at the University of Leeds. University of Leeds has wonderful chemistry laboratories. I was really envious of their chemistry laboratories that are going. I was talking to one of their senior demonstrators there, and they said, these labs are great. And he said, yeah, they are great, but we still have to teach our chemistry degree on a rota, which means that students do practicals on a sort of circus. Some students do a practical 1 week, other students do that same practical the week after, which means that their practicals run out of sync with their lectures. And students complain. I'd like to have the lectures before I do the practicals. That's perfectly reasonable. This is the University of Leeds. Huge noise, pioneers about lecture capture. So I said to him, well, you capture all of your lectures. You've got last year's lectures. Why don't you make last year's lectures available to this year's students before they do the practical? Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. If you take the same lectures and you deliver them every year in exactly the same fashion and you capture them in exactly the same fashion, that's such a waste. It's a waste on all sorts of levels. Let me tell you another level on which it's a waste. If you actually listen back to your own recordings, and that's a really powerful thing to do in terms of self-observation, you will find that of your hour-long presentation, maybe 40 minutes of it are actually delivering stuff, and the other 20 minutes are administrative pauses while people come in and out. They are broken bits of chalk. They are trying to get the computer to wake up. All of those recordings are then put in a blanket fashion onto the virtual learning environment, and it's the student's job to advance through them, or maybe actually not, maybe just to wait until the thing goes on. Now, let's say it's 10 minutes per lecture. 10 minutes per lecture times the number of lectures times the number of students. So I would argue it is worth editing those lectures, but not for 1 year. If you're teaching level 1 physics, level 1 chemistry, level 1 biology, That stuff hasn't changed in 50 years. It's not going to change next year. You can deliver those same tailored lectures or use those same tailored recordings the following year. They will be just as valuable to your students. Now, the lecture flipping model says, okay, let's go a step further. Let's say that we are no longer going to deliver content in the lecture theatre. Rather, we're going to free up the precious contact time with our students, not to just deliver the material and expect them to think about it in their own time and do their own homework problems with no help. No, we're going to deliver the content offline and in the simplest fashion. Remember I said I was a pragmatist? If you want to flip, Year 1, record your classic lecture course. Year 2, use that lecture resource as the basis of your flipping. Don't spend hours in your office recording additional material because you won't have the adrenaline fuel. It just won't be the same. Use the resources that you actually have at your disposal. So that's the flipping model, where you take the content that you've delivered. Now, it doesn't have to be a recorded lecture. It could be, God forbid, we could ask them to read a textbook. That would be novel, wouldn't it? We could ask them to read a textbook or even to use the enormous number of brilliant open educational resources that are out there on the net. We could do all of those things, and then in the lecture theatre, we could use that precious time in a constructive way to build knowledge, levering the large number of students, levering the fact that the expert is there amongst the students. That's the idea behind flipped teaching. Okay, so what do my students say about it? Well, on one hand, I'm practicing, so these quotes come from last year's first year chemistry course. And when I say first year chemistry, I guess I'm talking about year 2 in the Scottish system. So Year 2 chemistry students, a completely flipped course. Everything required my students to actually view in advance. So I'm going to invite you to just read the yellow text on the slide. Okay, so those are the pros, and these are the negative statements. Right, now that's unusual, isn't it? A keynote speaker who shuts up for a minute. I did that very, very deliberately. There is a lot of nonsense out there. The greatest nonsense of all in learning and teaching is, of course, VARC. Visual, audio, kinesthetic. That is complete rubbish. It's so dangerous to label your learners as visual. That means they switch off if you're not doing something in visual, or audio, or kinesthetic learners. There's no evidence for VARC. You can get a student to fill out a questionnaire and express a preference. I can't argue with a preference. A student will express a preference to you, but it is complete nonsense to suggest that certain learners are visual, audio, or kinesthetic. And so an additional piece of nonsense is that PowerPoint slide, that particular PowerPoint slide, is a visual learning aid. Is it rubbish? What is a visual learning aid about that? Those are words. We don't know an awful lot about how the human brain works. Most of what is out there, and I will use a technical term, so apologies for that, most of what is out there is neurobollocks. Okay? But what we do know is that when you read, you are using the same part of your brain as when you listen. So if I am talking to you and expecting you to read this at the same time, then that's not going to work. Nobody can really multitask in the way that we sometimes attribute people doing. If, on the other hand, I read this material out to you, that would be rather insulting, wouldn't it? That would imply that you can't read. So better, if you actually have a quote and you want your students to take it in, is to shut up and let them listen to it. So this is the approach that I've tried to take here. Now, I guess I could just... I love this particular one here. Lancaster depends too much on understanding material. Guilty. I am so guilty of that criticism. I really am. I present material and then I explain to students the underlying concepts, and I say, if you understand the underlying concepts, all you need to remember are the underlying concepts, and you can work out how reagent A reacts with reagent B. You don't need to remember all of those balanced equations. I don't want you to become a parrot, I want you to become a chemist. I want you to understand how A reacts with B and makes C. I'm so guilty, and yet, in England, we have A-levels. Have you ever seen the A-level syllabus? It's incredible. It's ridiculous, because there is no way you can actually teach that material in the time available. You can train someone to pass an exam, but you sure as anything cannot teach the material. And so students believe that the way to, what teaching constitutes in England is preparing someone for an exam. So if I get to week 6 of my semester-long module and I have not given them a past paper and a set of model answers for that past paper, then I must be a rubbish teacher, because I am not preparing them for the examination. And so that's the kind of thing, you know, that leads to the kind of comments that we see on the slide there. Okay, so there were comments there. Students resent having to do things in their own time. Now, I'm guessing you have a credit type system. We have 20 credit modules. A 20 credit module is supposed to relate to 200 hours of student time. Now, if it relates to 200 hours of student time, then that means that if students are receive 30 lectures, then they've got 170 hours to play with. So why watching screencasts for 20 hours should be a waste of their precious time, I've no idea. But that's what we're up against in terms of doing this. And frankly, my job is actually not to teach chemistry. My job is to be a successful deliverer of student satisfaction and to get my students good honours. And any teaching of chemistry that I do is for my own satisfaction and is incidental to doing that. Okay? So that's how I feel in the background. I told you I'd have some provocative statements. Here's a provocative statement. I actually believe that there's more truth in this than any of us would care to admit. Education gives to us that which remains after we have forgotten all that we have learned in the schools, or in the universities for that matter. It is my contention that we deliver way too much content on our degree programs, and that the only way students can reasonably respond to this is a very strategic, short-term cramming approach to the examinations, leading to phenomena like, okay, if you don't believe me, ask yourself this thought experiment. What would happen if I took my 4th year students and gave them the first year exam? Are you confident that they would do well? So my own institution, they actually took the A-level paper that our students, this is UEA, they need A's to get into biology at UEA. They gave them the paper in September and they failed almost to an individual, not transforming 1 or 2 grades, not dropping 5%, dropping 60%, failing the examination completely. You know, what is the point in an education system that is as fickle and as superficial as doing that? The solution, I think the solution, and this is why I describe myself as post-flipping. So in order to flip, what you have to do is you have to ask yourself, what is the really important part of my course? And then you ask questions about the really important part of your course. That's how you flip. If you have decided what's really important about your course and you are focusing on that in your flipped sessions, what do you actually expect to happen with the rest of the material? When's that going to be taught? Why is it in there? Is it because it's always been in there? Is it because it's a historical baggage that you don't even expect the students to graduate learning? Acquire the courage to cut some of that stuff and free yourself perhaps from what some students, not all students, but I have to appeal. This is the NSS era. I can't have 50% of my students. I mean, look at the mess. Now, really, look at the mess a country gets itself in if it provides a yes-no choice and allows 50% of people to do it. So I cannot, in an NSS environment, deliver something that 50% believe in. Okay, let me give you an example of a bit of teaching. This is a wonderful experiment that we're going to do. Remember, I'm no longer in the chemistry laboratory. My lecture theatre, not all like this, I admit. My lecture theatre is now my laboratory. So I'm going to give you a very short lesson on a fundamental principle of physics that is really important in chemistry. And it is that opposites attract. So imagine that I've got a fist and a palm, and these are opposites. Now, those will attract one another. Two fists will repel one another, and two palms will repel one another. So, like charges repel, opposite charges attract. That's a fundamental principle, a concept of electrostatics. Okay, that's as much teaching as I feel we need to do. Let me pose a question. So Craig is coming in. What I need you to do, now this is chemistry, but this chemistry depends on the extremely simple electrostatic principle that I've just done. Okay? So I'd like you to answer this question. If you, after my short exposition, still don't know, that's fine. Guess. Or give an informed, intelligent estimate. But I want you to commit yourself to an answer to this question. Okay, we'll have to be fairly quick with this, I suspect. Okay, Craig, can we... I mean, there's always a law of diminishing returns. The fact that 22 of you only apparently have used this is a little bit disappointing to you. The system's not working. To be fair, I suspect that's to do with the Wi-Fi capacity of the venue more than anything else. You know, it's independent of pedagogy, it's independent of technology, it's down to the infrastructure. And as we've just heard from Frank, they are onto it. They are going to solve these problems at an institutional level. But everybody here has an answer to this question. So let's see what they are. Okay, right. Now, imagine that you are a teacher and you get a spread of answers like that. Now, you may be disappointed at a spread of answers like that. You may think to yourself, well, I've explained it brilliantly. It only took me a minute, but I explained it brilliantly. They should all have got it. But you've had your chance. The way that peer instruction works is now you actually take that problem and you turn it over to your students, to your audience. So what I'd like you to do, if we can reset that so people can't see it, I'd like you to discuss this problem amongst the people sitting next to you. So turn to your neighbour. And I don't just want you to shout the loudest, although I expect you to be vociferous, as promised in the abstract, is I want you to explain why the answer is what you think the answer is. Okay, I can't hear you yet. Okay, that's right. So, in the interest of time, now it's such a shame because actually, you know, again, the supreme irony of a keynote like the most important thing that you will take away from my keynote is nothing I've said. It's the experience you just had of talking to one another about a conceptual idea in chemistry. That is the powerful thing that posing that question has facilitated. And that's what we need our questions to do. We don't want our students in the first instance to all know what the answer is. What's achieved by a question like that? What does it achieve? All you find out is that your students know something. I'm trying to teach them. I'm trying to find a way of getting them to learn something new. So we need a question that is in that, what we get called the sweet spot, or I like to call it the Goldilocks zone. That is not too easy. On the other hand, it can't be too hard either. If absolutely nobody had the right answer to that question when we started that round of discussion, there was no hope nor expectation that we would move as a body towards the right answer. Okay, can you vote again? Okay, so those of you who voted on this one, we need a fresh vote now, a vote informed by your discussions. Okay, now it is beautiful. When you let that discussion genie out of the bottle, you might have had a perfectly quiet lecture theatre before that, but now everybody's busy talking to each other. That's okay to discuss stuff. This is how the real learning takes place. Okay, so nothing appears. Do we assume that people are answering the question or not, Craig? We don't know. Okay, so the Wi-Fi has dropped completely. Okay, let's go. I mean, this occasionally happens. And one of the things that I would observe about being an academic doing this kind of thing is I promised you it wasn't actually about the technology, it was about the pedagogy. Now, I use technology, again, for another reason, is that some people are very shy and don't like to expose their answers to a question in public. And we want to respect those people. However, you're all delegates from universities at the Learning and Teaching Conference. You're not that shy. You're prepared to commit yourselves, at least to a question as neutral as this one. Do we think it's working again now? I'm not going to let you but please press your buttons very quickly because we do need to do that. Right, so, okay, it comes in very quickly when it comes in. Right, if we can see how people have responded. Craig? Okay, so there are two ways of it. You can do this blind, but I choose not to do it blind. I choose to show people what is happening to their evolution of answers. Do you know what the correct answer is? The correct answer is B. Do you know what's really remarkable, I mean incredibly remarkable about this question? So you've got this question right in huge numbers. What's really remarkable about this question? Are there any chemists here at all? Anybody who confesses to being a chemist? The worst possible people to pose this question to are chemists. Chemists, I posed this question at the European Chemistry Society Education Symposium in Seville a few months ago. I posed this question, and it didn't work as a peer instruction question at all, because every single chemistry person there put A. Every last one of them put A. Why did they put A? They put A because in chemistry, GCSE and earlier levels, you are taught lithium wants to lose an electron. Lithium wants to lose an electron. This is garbage. It's nonsense. Lithium is an atom. It doesn't have a personality. It doesn't want anything. And look at the electrostatics. A neutral atom pulled apart into a cation and an anion. That's nuts. And the little lesson in electrostatics that I gave everybody in this audience is enough for you to recognise that it's nuts. But the poor chemists have been bombarded with misconceptions for years and years and years, and so the chemists can't answer this question, basically. And it's absolutely amazing. So I've talked about where the question should be. I think it's a really valuable exercise, and I encourage you to do it on your own, or indeed, even better, get a project student to work with you. Look at the kind of questions you are posing and put them against Bloom's taxonomy. Now, Bloom's taxonomy is one of those things that's normally presented as a triangle, isn't it? Okay? I prefer this representation of Bloom's taxonomy, but let's be clear, Bloom's taxonomy is not evidence-based. There is no evidence that remembering is a less higher order cognitive skill than understanding, but I think most of us kind of believe it is. And that I'm at the position where I don't want my students to remember the answer to every conceivable question on a degree in chemistry. It's not going to work. It's certainly not going to endure. I am struggling. You know, people talk about higher education being about higher order skills. We're teaching our students to analyse, evaluate and create. Yeah, of course we are. I'm struggling at the understanding level. I'm working with my students that they understand things rather than depend on memory in terms of doing this. So that's what the value of Bloom's taxonomy is to me. Right, I'm not going to pose this question, but it'll be available to all of you if you want to do it. Not all misconceptions are created equally. So what sort of a misconception is lithium wants to lose an electron? So proposition level misconceptions are relatively easy to deal with. I say relatively easy to deal with, depends how you've encountered them, I guess. So let's take we only use 10% of our brains. Rubbish. That is a proposition level misconception. We don't really know exactly where this proposition level misconception comes from. However, 10% of our brains is grey matter, 90% of our brains is white matter. Maybe that's where the original figures actually come from. We use all of our brains. If, you know, has anyone seen the film Lucy with Morgan Freeman? You know, I'm sorry, that's complete rubbish. Utter rubbish. Entertaining film, but utter rubbish. We all use 100% of our brains, maybe not perfectly efficiently, but we use 100% of our brains. So that's a proposition level misconception. A flawed mental model. Okay, a flawed mental model would be something like we only have one circulatory system. So the heart pumps oxygenated blood around the body. That's a flawed mental model because, of course, there are two sets of chambers in the heart, and the heart pumps deoxygenated blood around the lungs and then oxygenated blood around the rest of the body. So that's a flawed mental model. Ontological miscategorization. Now, I am one of those people who thinks that educationalists coming in, giving keynotes, using enormous amounts of jargon and leaving absolutely everybody behind is not clever. If they fail the first hurdle and using language that people can understand, then that is not very clever, okay? I guess we run out of terms to describe different misconceptions that people can take on. What is an ontological miscategorization? Well, it's something like believing that water in pipes behaves in exactly the same way as electricity in wires. That would be an ontological miscategorization. If you address an electrical circuit thinking that the electrons are behaving like water in a pipe, then you will make the wrong assumptions about how that electrical circuit works. An embedded belief. I'm beginning to believe that lithium wants to lose an electron is an embedded belief. It is very, very hard for me to address it. Very hard for me to address it. A very good example of an embedded belief would be teaching evolution in a community of creationists. That's going to be very difficult. You can present the facts and the evidence-supported evolution, but let's be clear. You are suggesting that their entire way of life is built on a lie, that their parents are liars, that everything they believe has no basis. That's a hard sell, and that's going to be something that is very, very difficult for you. So we have to be aware of the kind of misconceptions that we're actually addressing. And we need to pose our questions in this Goldilocks zone. So why do I use that? Well, the Goldilocks zone is the area in an exosolar system, or indeed our own solar system, where liquid water can exist on the surface of a planet. So it means a question that is not too easy, waste of time, not too hard, no good will come of it. Just in that sweet spot. And so I believe, actually, that the best people to determine what the sweet spot for your question is are the students themselves. So the way that I've moved on, what I've presented is, I guess, classical Mazur peer instruction. But what I suggest to you is that one of the real bottlenecks for active learning in the lecture theatre is the questions. What sort of questions sit in the Goldilocks zone? Most of us have a huge amount of experience we can fall back on. We have some idea of what our student misconceptions are. But it is so easy to miss misconceptions. And if you miss them, you can't confront them, you can't address them, you can't correct them. You can't give students the correct conception. So what I do is actually crowdsource answers to my questions. I'll often work with students on platforms like Peerwise in order to generate questions, but live in the lecture theatre, using sort of word cloud type tools, I will get students to tell me what they think the answers to the question are. So a really classic peer instruction question is, where does most of the mass of an oak tree come from? So think about that for a while. Where does most of the mass of an oak tree come from? And the classic peer instruction question gives 4 potential answers: the air, the rain, the soil, and the acorn. I crowdsourced the answers to that question, and several of my students said the sun. Now, the sun was never part of the original set of model answers for that peer instruction question. However, it's obvious, if you think about it, all the energy comes from the sun, so that misconception can easily develop that the mass of a tree must come from the sun as well. And if you don't find out, if you don't crowdsource some of these misconceptions, then you can miss them and you might not be able to do anything about them. Okay, so very briefly, how do you know the answer to that original question I posed? Well, there are 2 good ways of doing it. One is to get an observer. Now, I bet, being a wonderful institution, the University of Glasgow has peer observation. And peer observation, in my experience, often works like this. Someone comes in, observes your lecture, you go for a cup of coffee, discuss it, and they say, that was an absolutely brilliant lecture. You might want to use a slightly bigger font on slide 20, and pink and yellow clash a little bit, but it was a really good lecture. Carry on the great work. Okay? I think we should actually focus a lot more, not on what the lecturer is doing, but what are the students doing? And so Anna Wood has basically developed a methodology for doing that. But it's quite intensive. It requires someone to sit in the lecture and not observe the lecturer, but to observe the students. What are they doing at any one point? Now, if you practice full-on peer instruction like I did in that second year chemistry class, not like we've been doing today. Today is at an only small fraction of the time have you been practicing anything approaching active learning. If you do it full on with an accomplished practitioner, about 50% of the time the students might be engaged in something you could approximate to active learning. That's if you throw the kitchen sink of peer instruction methodology at your students, and that's using an observer. But you don't have time or money to do that. Just this year, in Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, which, for incidentally, if there's anybody from the Ref Police here, that's a 4-star journal. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, you can actually use an app. So all you need is an unedited version of the audio taking place in your lecture theatre. You take that audio track, you paste it into the app will analyse it and tell you how much of the time your students are practising active learning. And it can do that because there's a huge difference in the noise. As I speak, the volume in this room goes up and down like this. When you're speaking, there's a general background hubbub. And that hubbub is easily distinguished from the noise of a single person speaking. And that crude statistic of how long are the students talking to each other, how long is the lecturer lecturing, can give you the answer you're looking for. Right, we must finish with a piece of active learning. So here is a question. Which one of the 3 little pigs built the most environmentally sustainable house? Was it little pig number 1, working through the medium of straw? Little pig number 2, whittling away with wood? Or little pig number 3, using bricks? I should have a 4th option here of sandstone, I guess, basically. But, okay, so I need you to commit to one of those answers on your own in the first instance. Okay, remember this is utterly anonymous. You've got nothing to fear and everything to gain by experiencing the pedagogy from the root up, I guess. Right. So we'll give it a couple of seconds. Okay, I think we need to poll these. Okay, I don't think we have time for a round of peer instruction at this point. Anybody like to comment on this question? How does it differ from the lithium one that I presented to you earlier? Do you know what I think? I think there's no right answer to this question. I think it depends entirely on what sort of environment you're living in, what your local materials are, whether it's a temporary build or a permanent build, as we've already heard about here. There is no one answer to this question. And so for those of you who say this peer instruction business, it's only relevant in the physical sciences where there's a single definitive answer to a question, I say no. Peer instruction is a device for getting students thinking to one another about the underlying conceptual understanding. And so if you can have a discussion about the question, then it can work for your pedagogical aims in the lecture theatre. So I find actually that there's always someone who puts D, incidentally, where there's an extra answer in here. Okay, so what am I suggesting? I've not got conclusions here, I've got suggestions. I want you to use your captured lectures more constructively. That anecdote from Leeds is ridiculous. I mean, what's the point in having a captured lecture unless it somehow improves the way that you can deliver your teaching? And flipping, is an extreme, and you can do that to various levels. But what you must do, please, is accommodate active learning. You've got to get your students thinking in the lecture theatre. Otherwise, this is Glasgow. We don't get snow in Norwich, but I imagine you get cold weather at least part of the year here. You drag students into spaces, okay, they're beautiful, but they don't want to get up at 9 o'clock in the middle of February unless there's a really good reason to do it. Make your contact time with your students a really good time for them to turn up. And look at your questions. Have you just got Yakkas? And do you think Yakkas is brilliant? And are you using Yakkas to pose lots and lots of questions in any one given lecture? Because if you are, that novelty is going to wear out. No matter how good Yakkas is, you've got to pose worthwhile questions. It's not about how many questions you can pose in a lecture, it's about the quality of the questions you pose in the lecture. And beware misconceptions. Peer instruction is the best way I know of addressing misconceptions, but they're stubborn, they're hard work, and they take a lot of challenge. And finally, a gallery of acknowledgements. So I'm very grateful to the last 2 people on here, without whom I don't think I'd be standing here today. And thank you all for engaging. Thank you.